Hey there, welcome back to the channel. So far we've discussed relaxing piano, violin, and cello music, but I've mentioned several times before that I'm an orchestra conductor, and there's an entire world of orchestral music that we should explore. So today we begin that journey by discussing the top 5 most relaxing pieces of orchestral music. Hey everyone, my name is Matthew, and welcome to Calm Insomniac, where we're a community of people trying to get a better night's sleep. If you're new here, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for notifications. As always, we need to address a few considerations before we get into our list. First, let's remember the 4 criteria that can make classical music good for relaxation. And that is, we want the music to be instrumental only, repetitive, in a simple form, and have a consistent, calm tempo. Remember, these are just guidelines, and if you want more information about those criteria, I suggest you watch this video right over here. Second, I decided to choose standalone pieces only instead of picking movements out of larger works, and this was just so I could limit my choices somehow. Finally, choosing relaxing orchestra music is a lot trickier than it might seem. So far, we've only discussed pieces that are for a solo instrument or for a soloist with an accompaniment, and sometimes that accompaniment has been for an orchestra, but the point is we're dealing with one main instrument and then maybe something else going on behind it. But with an orchestra, we're dealing with potentially every instrument, and all of those instruments can be equally important at one point or another. This leads us to an important musical consideration. When composers decide which instrument plays which part, this is called orchestration, and different orchestrations or groups of instruments playing together can sound differently. This is because of each instrument's timbre, and timbre is the unique sound quality that differentiates one instrument from another. In other words, timbre is how you can tell the difference between a flute and a trumpet just by hearing them. This is a huge, important topic for composers, and even some famous composers have written books about the subject, including Berlioz and Rimsky-Korsakov. When we're talking about an orchestra, there are a lot of factors to consider. One of the reasons the string section, or the violins, violas, cellos, and basses, sound so good and lush and beautiful together is because their sounds are homogeneous, or they all sound relatively similar, just higher or lower versions of each other. However, if we compare this to the woodwind family, the woodwinds have many different timbres in their family. The flute sounds very different from the clarinet, which sounds very different from the oboe, which sounds different from the bassoon. And certain combinations of instruments may or may not work well together. Additionally, within each instrument's range, the timbre can change. So for example, on the clarinet, when they play extremely high, it has a very bright, strident sound. But when they play in their lowest range, it has a very warm, chocolatey sound. And all of these factors need to be considered when a composer is orchestrating their work. So by discussing full orchestra, we've complicated things because we're dealing with so many instruments at once, and the combinations of these instruments may or may not make a piece be relaxing. The pieces I've chosen for this list are, I would argue, universally considered to be relaxing, but keep in mind that these are my opinion. And with all of that out of the way, let's get into the top 5 most relaxing orchestral pieces. In no particular order, let's start with number 1, which is Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. This piece is one of the most important musical works in all of music history. The piece is based on a poem, and the poem tells the story of a faun taking an afternoon nap. Debussy has appeared a couple of times on one of our previous lists, but as a quick reminder, he was a French composer and he's considered an impressionist composer, though Debussy personally hated that term. As an impressionist composer, this means that, like the painters of that same era, his music is blurry or suggests images rather than explicitly stating anything. The piece was written in 1894 and drastically pushed the limits of harmony for music at the time. When you listen to the piece, it has an atmospheric quality and definitely illustrates the story of the poem. There are a few ways that Debussy achieves this. First, Debussy uses a smaller orchestra. He mostly uses the strings and the woodwinds. The only brass instruments that are present are the horns and trumpets, and he uses percussion very sparingly. Next, he uses a very particular scale which is known as the whole tone scale. This is different than something we traditionally find or use in Western music, and it evokes a certain Asian or Indian influence. It only uses one type of interval, and this interval has a little bit more of an open sound than when we listen to a regular major or minor scale. Finally, the piece only uses a few melodic statements, and these can all be found or are based on the opening flute solo, which is extremely famous, and I'm sure you've all heard it before. The second piece on our list is Ravel's Pavane for a Dead Princess. Maurice Ravel was a French composer who was a contemporary of Debussy, and like Debussy, did not like being labeled as an impressionist composer. Pavane for a Dead Princess was originally written for solo piano in 1899, but was later given an orchestral version by Ravel himself in 1910. The piece is based on a pavane, which is a slow processional Spanish dance that was popular in the Baroque era. Ravel himself said that the title actually has nothing to do with the composition, he just liked how those words sounded together, so it is not based on any actual princess. Like Debussy's Prelude, this piece has some of the same atmospheric qualities, but not as much. This piece is much more melodically straightforward than Debussy's Prelude. The melody is simple and confined to a relatively narrow range. The piece opens with a beautiful horn solo playing this melody, but this horn solo is actually pretty hard for the player because it is in a very high range and at a soft dynamic. Additionally, this piece is harmonically very simple compared to Ravel's other works. This piece mostly uses simple major and minor chords, whereas if you listen to other works by Ravel, he uses very complex harmonies that sometimes almost sound like jazz. As a quick final side note, this piece has often been considered one of the most beautiful pieces of music of all time. The third piece on our list is Barber's Adagio for Strings. We finally have an American composer on one of these lists. Samuel Barber was one of the most influential American composers, and he was a two-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize in Music. The Adagio for Strings was written in 1936 and is a string orchestra arrangement of one of the movements of his string quartet, Opus 11. And even though this piece is just for string orchestra, I'm still including it on this list because orchestras play it all the time on their regular concert programs. This is another example of a piece that is so beautiful because of its simplicity. Melodically, it is confined to a very small range, and it moves in stepwise motion, meaning the melody only moves up or down one note at a time without skipping over any notes. And the overall motion of this piece moves at a very slow pace. It is slow harmonically, melodically, and the tempo is very slow. So there isn't a lot of motion, there's a lot of very long, sustained notes. And since this is for a string orchestra, we have a very lush, homogeneous sound which is really pleasing to the ear. This piece is usually considered sad rather than relaxing, but as I've argued before, I think hearing something that is sad or represents struggle is a good thing to listen to when we're going to bed. It gives us a moment of catharsis as we reflect on our day and let go of whatever might have happened before we go to sleep. And because this piece is so often considered sad, it is frequently performed during periods of mourning. For example, this piece was played after the announcements of Presidents Franklin D. Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy's deaths. It was also played at the funerals for Albert Einstein and Grace Kelly, and has often been performed to honor the memory of the victims of terrorist attacks, including the 9/11 attacks. The fourth piece on our list is Albinoni's Adagio in G minor. Since this piece is on this list, it clearly is relaxing. It meets all of the criteria, it is often played by a string orchestra, but rather than just repeat myself, I want to share with you the piece's unusual history. The Adagio in G minor is originally written for strings and organ, but is often performed for string orchestra alone. The piece is commonly attributed to Tommaso Albinoni, who is one of the most influential Italian composers of the Baroque era. However, the piece was actually written by Remo Giazzotto, who was a 20th century musicologist and cataloger of Albinoni's works. After World War II, Giazzotto supposedly found a manuscript fragment of a previously unknown work of Albinoni in the Saxon State Library in Dresden, Germany. The library had preserved most of its collection, even though most of its buildings were destroyed during the war. Giazzotto concluded that this musical fragment was from one of Albinoni's trio sonatas, which was a very popular form during the Baroque era. Giazzotto decided to complete the movement based on the small musical fragment and from his knowledge of Albinoni's music. After completing the work, he registered the copyright and published the piece in 1958. But here's the problem. Giazzotto never gave any proof of the manuscript that he actually found. He never presented it or showed it to anyone. Additionally, the Saxon State Library has no official record showing that this manuscript was in their collection. This is considered one of the great mysteries or scandals of the classical music world, and current musicologists still debate whether or not the fragment of Albinoni's music was real or fake. Either way, we know for sure that the majority of the work was composed by Giazzotto. It's kind of cool learning about these classical music scandals that have existed, and there have been several. If you're curious about learning more about some of them, I'm going to link down below to one of Two Set Violin's recent videos. They recently talked about some of the top scandals or controversies in classical music, and I definitely suggest that you check that out. And the fifth and final piece on our list is Mascagni's Intermezzo from Cavalleria Rusticana. Now, I'm slightly cheating with this selection because the intermezzo is technically in the middle of an opera. However, this piece is very frequently performed on its own, just like the overture to an opera is usually done. And this piece is very frequently performed by youth orchestras. Pietro Mascagni was an Italian composer who is known for his operas, specifically for writing verismo operas. Verismo operas are trying to realistically depict the poor class, particularly in Italy. Cavalleria Rusticana is Mascagni's most famous opera and is also one of the greatest examples of a verismo opera. The intermezzo is an instrumental interlude that takes place during a scene transition toward the very end of the opera. It's written for a smaller percentage of the orchestra, mostly using just the strings and a few woodwinds. The significance of this piece comes from the opera's story. In true operatic fashion, in the scene right before the intermezzo, characters are discovering that people are having affairs with one another, and vengeance is being sworn, and one character is staying in a church to repent for his sin of exposing this affair. So the intermezzo is literally the calm before the storm that happens at the end of the opera. It is a representation of not only the character praying in a church, but also the last moment of peace that many of these characters will have because, spoiler alert, one character will die. This piece is very short, lasting only a couple of minutes since it is technically a scene change, and it's incredibly serene and very slow moving, and it's just such a beautiful piece to hear, especially live. There we go. Those are the top 5 most relaxing pieces of orchestral music, but really we have just scratched the surface. There are so many more pieces to talk about, so many other composers, specific movements of larger works to discuss, so we will have many more lists talking about orchestra music. Let me know in the comments down below, what pieces of orchestra music do you like listening to for relaxation? Again, there is just so much literature out there that I would love your input, and we can possibly include them in one of our future lists. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow me on Facebook and Pinterest, check out my website, and join my email list. All of those links will be down below. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more of my videos talking about relaxing classical music, then I suggest you check out this playlist over here. And if you want to see one of my recent videos talking about why we're cranky when we don't get enough sleep, then I suggest you check out this video down over here. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.